just said, look.
We're gonna have a good day. And all my homies wanna ride today. And all these mamas look fly today. And all we wanna do is get by today. Hey, we're gonna have a good day.
All right, 8th grade, good morning. Today we're going to talk about the aftermath of World War I. And pretty much going to wrap up this section. You'll have a quiz next week. We'll do that online. And I'll give you some quiz prep for that. But it's kind of this whole idea again of, is the United States an empire? And we're going to start with the Plains Wars all the way through World War I, talking about that. All right, so aftermath of World War I. So I threw up a couple maps here. And just showing you the percentage of population that was lost in a lot of countries. Quite a bit, and I mentioned this before, in Africa, not just Europe, and part of why it is seen as a world war. And you'll notice the United States up here also is not, does not have as heavy casualties as some of the other countries in Europe and Africa. So casualties from World War I, we talked a little bit about this the last time, but approximately 10 million military deaths, approximately 10 million civilian deaths, for a total of 20 million people that died in World War I, and then almost an equal number in terms of wounded, both for military and civilian. Something that has probably been around forever, but really comes to public consciousness out of World War I is what was called at the time shell shock. We know it today as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And I mean, the level of carnage and chaos that these people were exposed to, some of them for 4 or 5 years, it takes a toll on the human psyche. And so, this was sort of the first time where it was really sort of systematically recorded and observed, and we'll have a similar experience coming out of World War II. And certainly a lot has been done with that over the years in terms of improvement in recognizing it and being able to treat it. Also coming out of the war is over 100,000 amputees. This picture here is people learning to walk with what were prosthetic limbs at the time. And again, that's something else that obviously has improved very much from this time period. So before the war actually ends, Wilson gives a speech to Congress. It includes what he has become to be known as his 14 points, essentially seeking security in the world and specifically in Europe. So I'm not going to read all these to you. They're basically sort of these high-minded, just be open, be frank type ideas. One that is interesting, though, is, on the right-hand side here, talking about a free, open-minded, absolutely impartial adjustment of colonial claims. In other words, deciding who owns what colonies based upon a strict observance of the principle that the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight. So in other words, these colonial populations, for example, the Philippines, which the U.S. owns at this time, the populations have to be involved in the decision-making, have equal weight. Or rather, I guess it says their interests, so not necessarily decision-making. But, it's an interesting concept that, obviously hasn't happened and doesn't really happen after this either. But, in the context of talking about it was the U.S. and empire, it's an interesting sort of point to have among his ideas for seeking security in the world. So his 14 points eventually lead to the League of Nations via the Versailles Treaty. So the Versailles Peace Treaty, the war ends, 1919. They call it the Big Four. So Prime Minister of England and France and Italy with the President of the United States. None of the Russians are there. They are in the middle of their own revolution. And the Central Powers. So they're making a peace treaty without the enemy powers being there. They're just going to show up and sign whatever they're given, which includes these points here. Germany lost 10% of its territory and all overseas possessions. They had to pay reparations that are in the modern equivalent of $500 trillion. And then Article 231 is where Germany accepts all guilt for starting World War I. So all these things are going to have an impact and quite honestly directly lead to World War II. All right, so if there wasn't enough death and destruction in the war itself, starting in 1918, before the war had ended, this outbreak of what became known as the Spanish flu, Spanish influenza. It's an H1N1 virus. They believe it's of avian origin, so in other words, passed from birds to humans. 500 million people, or about a third of the world's population, was infected. There were 50 million deaths worldwide, and 675,000 of those are in the U.S. It's interesting because, we talked about the Black Plague last year. That spread primarily through trade, whereas with this, we get global troop movements. And, again, not the same sort of measures that are in place right now with coronavirus, which is why I'm teaching you from home. I mean, these troops were moving about, they were being brought back to their home countries. And as you can see from this map, you get influenza in quite a few countries. So pretty much touching around the world. And again, that death toll is 50 million. So, over double what there was in World War One. And then also, as an aftermath of World War One, we have the Russian Revolution. This is essentially the birth of the Soviet Union, which will be around until 1989. For extra credit in the comments section, if you can tell me who this man is in the foreground pictured here, get an extra credit point. So 10 million dead between combat, typhus, so all disease, but typhus was a real big one, and famine, as these people die and these farms go untended. They were not growing food, and so a lot of people die from starvation. So between World War One, the Spanish flu, and the Russian Revolution, about 5% of the world's population dies, which is a big number. And anytime you have sort of death on that scale, that catastrophic, you are going to have impacts. Again, much as we discussed with the Black Death. So another outcome of World War One is these racial tensions that increase in the United States. So during the war, a lot of northern factory workers would join up or be drafted into the military. They'd go to Europe. And so we talked earlier this year about, African Americans being essentially in a condition of servitude through sharecropping. So this was an opportunity to basically leave that and have, to them, a well-paying job, better living conditions. And so it's what we call the Great Migration of African Americans moving from the south to the north to work in these factories and stockyards and other blue-collar jobs. So, and then another issue is African American veterans are coming back from Europe. They were treated equal. We talked about the Harlem Hellfighters. The French took them right away and put them into combat. Not to say there was no racism in Europe, but much, much less than there was in the U.S. And these troops had kind of answered the call for the United States to go fight against, the evil Germans and helped free Europe from the evil Germans. And now they come back to the U.S., and if they're in the South, they can't go in certain places. They're discriminated against both in terms of wages, no matter where they are, and living conditions. And so there's a lot of tension created from that. The Ku Klux Klan actually had a resurgence in 1919. I mean, we're talking going from a couple thousand to, over 100,000. So, that obviously adds to the racial tensions. And then specifically what happens in 1919, there's a man named Eugene Williams, 17-year-old African-American. He's swimming in the lake there in Chicago, and he actually goes from, the quote-unquote black swimming area to the white swimming area. A man there sort of eggs on some others, and they start throwing rocks at this young man. And whether it's unclear whether he was actually knocked out by a rock or just went deeper where he couldn't swim or whatever it was, but he ends up dying, ends up drowning. And it leads to the Red Summer, which are these riots that happen in Chicago. 38 people died, both white and black, over 500 wounded. And again, this goes back to, we talked how a lot of issues were never resolved with the Constitution. We go from the late 1700s to early 1900s, and we're dealing with a lot of, maybe not the same issues, but certainly repercussions from those issues and how they were not originally addressed. So, down in the comments, try not to, look online, don't look at your book. Just, what will the 1920s be like in the United States? World War One. The United States has come out on the winning side. There's been a lot of death, both from Spanish influenza war. But, the United States fueled a lot of the war in terms of its economy and lending money. And so, what will the 1920s be like? What can we expect? So give your best guess down in the comments. As always, it's been fun. Looking forward to talking with you guys and seeing what you did for your propaganda posters. And again, we will have a quiz next week, and I will talk to you tomorrow. And I will also post a video to kind of help you with that. All right, you guys take care, and I will see you tomorrow.